Okay, so hello guys, my name is Will with the To Know Him blog, and today we will be talking to Conley Owens, who is the author of a fairly recent book titled The Dorean Principle, A Biblical Response to the Commercialization of Christianity. If you're interested in getting the book, you can get it for free at thedorianprinciple.org, where you can find the PDF, the EPUB version, the audiobook, and there are instructions to order the hard copy, which I have right here, for free, which actually also comes with a bookmark and a helpful little pamphlet if you want to introduce your friends to it. So I'm here with Conley. Conley, could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Conley Owens. I'm a pastor of Silicon Valley Reformed Baptist Church. I'm bivocational at the moment. I'd love to be full-time at some point, but by day right now, I'm a software engineer at Google. And I live in Sunnyvale, California with my wife and 7 kids, soon to be 8.
Oh, congratulations. I didn't know that.
Thanks.
Okay, so Conley, the book is titled The Dorean Principle, and obviously it's hinged on this idea called the Dorean Principle, which essentially lays out an ethic for ministry fundraising. To get started, could you go ahead and define the Dorean Principle for us?
Right. So Dorean is the Greek word that means freely. Jesus said, Matthew 10:8, freely you received, freely give. So it's a book about what it means for ministry to be offered freely, when immediately after that, Jesus also says a worker is worthy of his food. You have to be able to hold these two things together. And a lot of people haven't really tried to do that. And the ones that haven't necessarily followed all the implications of it. So I'm trying to do that. And you see the same tension. I hate to use that word, but in Paul's ministry, where sometimes he's accepting money and sometimes he's refusing it, and what drives it. And so both of them use this Greek word Dorean to describe their preaching as being free of charge. And so that's why I call this the Dorean Principle. And the way I define the Dorean Principle is that support, material or otherwise, received by a minister as anything other than an act of co-labor compromises the sincerity of ministry. So I make this distinction between co-labor and reciprocity, where co-labor is Christians working together, partnering for the sake of the gospel. I'm giving the labor, you're supplying the funds to make it happen, and we're working together. Whereas reciprocity is I'm giving you the gospel, and so you're giving me money or whatever in return. And so I believe the Bible forbids all reciprocity in the gospel, and it commends all co-labor in the gospel.
Thank you. So one of the things that helped me with understanding reciprocity, I guess the easiest term is my co-blogger here, he used a term called transactional. Reciprocity is transactional. You give me this, I'll give you this. But you have a helpful tool in the book that's 3 concentric circles of 3 R words. Could you go ahead and talk about what those words are and how they relate to reciprocity?
Sure. So I think what that diagram was designed to address was the common misconception people have, even after they read the book, that as long as the money is being offered voluntarily, it's fine. And this isn't the biblical concern, right? Paul is being offered money voluntarily, and he's still refusing it. So requiring reciprocity would be the absolute worst, because then you're saying, you can't even have access to this teaching unless you give me money. Requesting, some people say, oh, well, I don't require, but I do request, I say suggest a donation, and I let them know what they ought to be giving me in exchange for this. So that's not as bad as requiring, but it's still engaging in reciprocity. And then the least worst of these, which is still reciprocity, still bad, is receiving reciprocity. So even if it's not solicited and someone offers you money in exchange for ministry, not to support you as a co-laborer, but feeling a sense of direct obligation to you rather than the Lord, and you receive that money, that would still be reciprocity. Now, there is a sense in which you could engage in any one of those 3 R words: requesting, receiving, and requiring. And it be co-labor, right? Like, I'm a bivocational minister, so I don't, I'm requiring money to do full-time ministry, right? I'm not doing ministry right now because I require money in order to do that. And certainly it's appropriate for ministers to request and even to receive co-labor. But the point of that diagram is to say it has nothing to do with how voluntary the money being given is or whether or not it's being solicited. And that's also another idea that a lot of people get, having read George Mueller and Hudson Taylor. A lot of people have developed ideas similar to mine from these other men who have gone before and had concerns about money in ministry. And they end up somewhere where they say, oh, well, you can receive money just as long as you never ask for it. And, and you're just up to you leave it up to the Lord so that you're living by faith. I don't think that's the biblical concern, although I get where they're coming from.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right. That's probably is one of the biggest misconceptions people can have after reading a book is I think in conversations I've had, the biggest example is the sale of a book. I think because it's just so common. Everybody's bought a book. A lot of people think, well, it's only wrong to require payment of that book. But what you're saying is it'd be wrong to accept, a free will offering of a book if that person feels required to give that because they received the book.
Right. Yeah. When I offer the book to people, a lot of times people say, well, let me give you something in exchange for this. And like, no, that's the whole point here.
Right.
If you want to support what I'm doing, there's a place on the website where, it'll show you how you can either support our church in a way that they know what this is going toward, or the publisher. The publisher is very passionate about this too. But yeah, I would not, you should not be receiving money when it's being offered in a reciprocal fashion. And then in addition, just saying something like suggested donation on something, what that's intending. It's like, hey, you kind of owe us here, and you're a bit of a schmuck if you don't.
Right. Now, so you defined the three main terms being obviously the Dorean Principle, co-labor, and reciprocity. Could you go, I think there's a fourth one that's pretty important that people don't worry about defining as much, and that's gospel ministry. Because
Sure.
I've seen a lot of the criticism that I have been able to come across the book is found in YouTube comments. And one thing people say is, well, what if I think the common example I saw is, what if I'm selling a candle? The purpose is to sell maybe a scented candle, but I put a verse on that. Is that technically gospel ministry? So what is gospel ministry?
Right. Yeah. And I do try to define this in chapter 11, but I certainly could have gone through more examples to give people a better feel of what I'm going for. But yeah, gospel ministry is when the gospel is being offered naturally. And yeah, all of God's word is related to the gospel. I am sort of, in the way that I wrote the book, I'm kind of depending on people to have reformed notions of the centrality of Christ in all the scriptures, so that they know that, you can't really divorce religious education from the gospel. And so any kind of religious education counts as gospel ministry. Now, however, and let me go ahead and add to that anything that attends to gospel ministry counts within that. So yeah, if someone, Jesus, when he was sending the disciples out, he told them to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, you receive without paying, give without pay. So he didn't say like, well, you can charge for the miracles, just don't charge for the gospel. And Paul didn't say, okay, well, I'm going to charge you for room, board, and for my ship ticket out here, but I'm not going to charge for the gospel. He said, I would not even pay for the food, or sorry, I would not even allow someone to give me food. Okay, so anything attending to gospel ministry where the essence of the thing is the gospel, and then you have all these other things that you're offering designed to support the gospel, whether they be miracles or your room and board, or now flip that, where the essence of the thing is a candle that you're selling, right, or a t-shirt, and then you slap on it something like a Bible verse, right, to make it more desirable to the customer. I don't think that counts, because the essence of the thing is not gospel ministry, even if you're tagging on biblical references, or if you're providing a Christian education. By Christian, I mean, in a private school, private Christian school, and you're teaching math within the framework that God created everything and is the author of mathematics. I don't think it's necessary that be offered freely, because the essence of the thing is mathematics. It's something secular, and then you're providing this framework of the gospel, and that's not I don't think you're violating the Dorean principle there. So there are a lot of examples that we could talk about, and a lot of them get pretty fuzzy, because there is this line: at what point does the essence become the gospel or not the gospel? One I sort of struggle with is Bibles, right? Like, if I give you a Bible, that's got the gospel in it, definitely. But now, what if we do like $150 luxury Bible where at what point does the essence of this thing become the leather and paper and not really the printed content that you can get anywhere easily?
Right.
I think there might be room for market there. And yeah, so some of these things are hard to understand, and I don't have all the answers. Part of my thought is, like, I might not be the one to figure out a lot of these things, right? There are other principles, like, for example, the regulative principle of worship. I'm going to go ahead and assume your audience is somewhat familiar with that, but it says something like, any element of worship that is not authorized by God is forbidden. Now, there's all kinds of hard questions to be answered about what things are authorized by God. Singing non-psalms in worship, music, like instruments, or just voices. There's a lot of hard questions that people disagree on, but everyone in the Reformed community agrees on that one principle, the regulative principle of worship. So I'm trying to offer this Dorean principle, and maybe as people adopt this, and hopefully they will, they'll differ on where the essence of something is the gospel or not the gospel. But I don't think that undermines the principle at all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And to give context for this conversation, kind of what I want to aim for, I would, mainly because I'm not a utilitarian, I'm not a pragmatist. I would like to
Amen.
mainly focus on, right. I would like to focus. I hope critics, when they come across this book, which I'm really looking forward to seeing people criticize this book, as weird as that sounds, because I want to see if there are any valid arguments that I haven't come up with against it. But I hope the critics focus on the principle as you're kind of talking about, because once you apply a principle, you talk about the regulative principle, there are different flavors, maybe regarding instruments, or the frequency of the Lord's Supper, or exclusive solemnity. So now we have the four main topics defined in the Dorean Principle. Can you introduce the listeners to the main passages that you exegete from to come to this principle? You reference Matthew, where Christ's words in Matthew, or the
Right.
other areas of the Bible that seem to teach the Dorean Principle.
Right. Yeah. So when I first went into this, I did not think there was going to be much scripture. I had come across, what was it? Oh, 3 John 7 and 8. 3 John 7 and 8 says, "For they have gone out for the sake of the name, not accepting anything from the Gentiles. Therefore, you ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth." So here John is telling Gaius that these missionaries ought to be given money because they did not take money from the ones they were being sent to. This is definitional co-labor and reciprocity distinction right here. It took me a long time to come up with that distinction, but that was the first verse that I noticed this in. And then I had also found 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul says that he will never take money from the Corinthians, and he said he was willing to rob Macedonia. And just to explain that a little, I believe that the context in Corinthians was that they were offering Paul money in exchange for his having planted the church. And Philippians, as you can see elsewhere, including in the book of Philippians, were frequently engaged in partnership, real partnership and co-labor with him. So he was willing to take from this less rich church, right? This poorer church rather than this rich church. A lot of people think, oh, well, maybe the Philippians were richer. No, that's not the case. They were poor by all accounts. So anyway, I was only aware of those two verses when I first started into this. And I thought, well, maybe I'll, do a little exegesis, and then I'll just have a bunch of speculative application. And as I went into this, I realized, oh no, wait, this is just everywhere. Paul, there's some things where Paul only talks once about, like the Lord's Supper. He only talks for half a chapter on that. But ministry fundraising, he's just always talking about. So this is all of 1 Corinthians 9 is about this. He brings it up in several other occasions. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. All of Philippians is around the gift that they had given him, right, and his partnership financially with them. So this is there's just so many texts in Scripture that deal with this, especially in the ministry of Paul.
Right. Right. Now, so you mentioned when you started with this, I forgot to mention this, but on the website, you can also get Conley's master's thesis, which is where you actually started with it, right? So
Right.
what prompted you to write on this for your master's thesis?
Right. Well, it was discovering those verses, like I mentioned, and realizing there was something there. And then before that, I guess what kind of had me ready to see things there, I've been involved in the open source community for a long time. And what that is basically an approach to software where you make source code available to people so that others can modify it, right? Any other engineering discipline, you're able to, say mechanical engineering, you're able to open the hood of your car, reverse engineer it, change things. You're not violating any laws. If you do that with software, you violate copyright in the process, and
Mhm.
and it's not really good for engineering. So what a lot of software engineers do is actually make the source code available. And this involves, more liberal use of copyright, right? Liberal meaning, you're free to use this uh,
Right.
digital material in the way that you would like. So seeing that being used in the software world led me to some dissatisfaction with how copyright is used in the church. And I never felt like I had something firm where I could say that this person is sinning by doing the thing that they're doing, and this other thing. But it did seem like things would be more efficient if people approach copyright differently. And when I started seeing what the Bible had to say about using ministry to gain money, and really that's the reason why people do enforce their copyright, or one of the main reasons anyway, I started seeing there might be something here, and that was what led me to really want to pursue that.
Okay. Now, so if you get into this in your book with the two that we're going to talk about, but with the principle, there's entailments that come with the principle. And I think one of those is the 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 ability of discernment raises with specifically with laymen discerning teaching. You talk about greedy and false teachers. I'm going to pull up the diagram in the book that you have so that the listeners can see it, which also the PDF is A1, it's actually linked, which I appreciate a lot. 7.1, where are you? Page. Okay, here we are. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So you should be looking at the PDF of the book, and here you have a Venn diagram of greedy teachers and false teachers. And you talk about how most people today would view greedy teachers and false teachers as two separate groups that intersect. What you say in the book is that biblically speaking, they're one in the same circle. Can you get into why that is?
Right. So yes, yeah, a lot of people think that, oh, well, a lot of greedy teachers are false and a lot of false teachers are greedy, but they're not necessarily one and the same. For example, you can have an ascetic teacher who, lives this life of poverty, and he's a false teacher because, he's some kind of Hindu mystic or something. Or you can have the other way around, where you have a true teacher who, struggles with greed. And sure, there is some truth to that, but the Bible, and speaking of the heart of the matter, makes a hard dichotomy between false teaching and true teaching, and that you either can serve the Lord or you can serve mammon, right? You either serve God or you serve money. And Paul says in 1 Timothy 6 that anyone who does not come with this teaching of Jesus is a lover of money. And so, yeah, the Bible makes this hard dichotomy. And what I believe it's doing in many of these passages that talk about these lovers of money is preparing the church for how they're supposed to discern false teachers. What is the fruit of a false teacher when he says you shall know them by their fruit? And I think there's a lot of things that we can truthfully say about that fruit. But I believe the primary fruit that the Bible is concerned about is the fruit of greed in ministry, specifically violating the Dorean Principle and trying to exchange money for ministry. Now, we live in a world where even the true teachers are engaged in that constantly. So it is not, it does not have much utility to the church to use that as a means of discerning false teachers. Because if I were to apply it right now, I can recognize some books on your bookshelf and I think they're all true teachers, but they're all selling their teaching, right?
Right.
So I would love to, I believe that if we can recapture this, and I believe this is something that's only been primarily lost in the past, in the past 300 years, but more intensely in the past 50, that we can restore this foundation from which laymen could say, hey, you're charging for ministry. I'm going to use that to discern that, you may be a false teacher.
Right. Which would be incredibly helpful for laymen. Now, you kind of mentioned already, but for example, on my bookshelf, every single one of those books was either bought by me or given to me by somebody who did buy those books. So, and I think in the book, you're very graceful with the men and women who have sold books or other related gospel ministries. But
Right.
would accepting or requiring reciprocity, would that necessitate greediness?
I think that definitionally you are saying that I have this ulterior motive, right? Sure, we might look at this person, we say, oh, they're only trying to recoup costs, and maybe I would, say, I would be very understanding personally and be like, oh, well, maybe they don't have the support model that they should have, and if they had read my book, maybe they realized they could have had this different support model, and so they're not trying to grow and profit. In that sense, they wouldn't be greedy, but definitionally, they are getting money from a source that they're not supposed to be getting it from, which would be definitionally covetousness and going beyond the means that God has provided for wealth.
Right. One helpful phrase you use in the book, I can't remember what chapter it was, but you talk about how money should be used as a means to ministry and not ends to ministry, which kind of relates to the idea of an ulterior motive.
Right.
Of course, those motives would be wanting to teach the truths of the Bible, and the other one would be profiting or supporting that ministry with that teaching, right?
Right. Yes. And a lot of people think, well, it's going to be okay as long as I'm not, as long as I'm not profiting, as long as I'm just recouping costs. Once again, that's just never the biblical concern. While I would be sympathetic with that, not here to be super judgmental about it. That's not the biblical concern. And it says, for we're not peddlers of God's word. We are men of sincerity as commissioned by God. In the sight of God, we speak in Christ. So, it's not like, oh, it's okay to peddle the word as long as it's not too much peddling, as long as it's only up to, recouping costs, or as long as it's only a little bit of profit so I can live my life reasonably. As long as I'm not Creflo Dollar or, Kenneth Copeland, it's all right. But there's never that boundary set. It never has to do with excess.
Right. Yeah. One of the interesting things that you talked about with AD on his show is that people will say, well, you talk about how people will justify the ministry of biblical teachers by saying, well, they have a better product, is what you kind of said, whereas in reality, right, they operate very similar to the false teachers that you mentioned, like Kenneth Copeland or Joel Osteen, those men.
Right. Yeah, that is one I've gotten a few times. And it's true. And it's easy to justify them because of that. But biblically, there's not a real difference.
Right. Now, one of the other entailments of the principle I noticed is that it seems like if this principle were to be applied, let's say across America, so that's where we live, it seems like it would bring a lot more accountability to different ministries, whether it be a parachurch ministry or a ministry of maybe a pastor or some other type of author. Can you explain how exactly that would bring more accountability to the ministry and why that would be important?
Sure. Right. I don't think I walk through a lot of the implications of this in the book. And so I haven't necessarily thought about all the implications that well either. But some things that come to mind immediately are if it is the congregation, if it's typically congregations giving, not always necessarily, but typically congregations working together, then, as a church, you would have the elders and deacons, who meet the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3 that are overseeing a lot of this ministry, as opposed to a lot of ministry today, because it's not funded by these means, doesn't have any elders or deacons involved. Secondly, when I purchase a book, I feel no obligation to, I don't feel like I'm in partnership with them, because I'm not, I don't feel any obligation to pray for them or anything like that. But if I give financially to something, maybe not every Christian feels this way. Maybe this is something that comes with a little more maturity, but I feel an obligation to pray. I feel like it's kind of irresponsible if I give money to a cause and I don't pray for them. So there's something added there when I am giving to some kind of ministry and I pray for them, and we're engaged in this real spiritual partnership. And if they and if I'm concerned about their way of life and other things like that in their ministry, I'm not going to be eager to support it later. Whereas, right now, where everything is done very commercially, or many things are done very commercially with book selling and things, there's not that kind of oversight, even from the ones who purchase, right? So.
Right. I think that makes perfect sense, because as you lay out with the term, you want to pray for them because you are very literally laboring alongside them with the ministry.
Right. Yeah, and I think there'd be a lot of joy for Christians too. What are you more excited to do, to pay bills or to, make an investment? I think most people would rather buy Bitcoin than to pay bills. And there's something joyful about, hey, watching your money go into this thing, maybe something great's going to come out of it. And, there's just a lot of joy that I think is being robbed from Christians, because they are receiving this ministry, paying for it, and not having the opportunity to invest that money.
Right. Now, in your chapter, you talk about this the most, I think, in your chapter on parachurch ministries. And one of the things you talk about is how one way this could be accountability of parachurch ministries, specifically under the accountability of the local church, which I'm assuming if somebody's listening to this as a Reformed person, the authority of the local churches for parachurch ministries is pretty high. You talk about how one thing that can be done is maybe there's a joint account that's managed by the local church and the parachurch ministry. And my question with that is, does co-labor have to be done directly through the local church, or can it be done separately by individuals, between individuals and ministry?
I think it can be done apart from the local church. The point in that chapter was not to say that it must be done by the local church. It is to say that there are a lot of temptations that are incurred by doing it through parachurch ministry. Yeah, and I haven't settled for myself exactly to what degree I'm comfortable with parachurch ministry, but regarding the Dorean Principle, basically the line in the sand is just that it incurs more temptation. Because when you don't have the regular giving of the local church, you have to get more creative and come up with ways of making money.
Right. I think this would actually be I'm not sure if I don't think we really went in depth with it, but with co-labor, you use a diagram where instead of reciprocity being directly one-to-one between the consumer and the producer, co-labor use a diagram to say the consumer, well, I shouldn't say consumer, the co-labor gives to God, which then gives to basically the producer,
Right.
the ministry leader. Can you
Right.
explain how exactly that works? Because I think I can kind of think of, well, maybe the local church is that intermediary, to God, the local church, then to the ministry. Can you explain that diagram?
Sure. I think I understand what you're saying with the local church, but yeah. So something that people occasionally misunderstand in the book is that I'm saying that we're not obligated towards ministers at all, or something along those lines. I am saying that, as the Bible says, we are obligated to ministers, but it is a very qualified obligation. It is an indirect obligation where our immediate obligation is to God. And that is not and that has significant importance, because if we consider ourselves only mediately obligated to these ministers and immediately obligated to God, in the Old Testament, it's the difference between idolatry and right worship. And to give an illustration of that, just considering what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9 about the priesthood. He makes an analogy to the priesthood and says, they were paid for their work, but how were they paid, right? It was not by the people giving directly to them. The people were offering their tithes and their sacrifices to God. And after they had been given to God, because the Lord was the inheritance of the Levites, they were able to receive of those tithes and of those offerings. So that indirection is important, because if the priests were to have taken the tithes or the offerings prior to them being given to God, you have them being set up as the object of worship. And this is precisely what happened with Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, when they took the meat before it was sacrificed.
Right.
And just going back to Matthew 10 also, the Lord, God is the Lord of the harvest. So when it's saying the employer is worthy, the worker is worthy of his wages, who is the employer in that analogy? It's God, right? Not the harvest. They may receive from the harvest, right? But God is the one who is employing them, and so he's employing them at the hands of the harvest. And this distinction, while subtle, is just really key to understanding how Jesus can say in one breath, don't receive pay, and in the next breath, expect pay. The pay is supposed to come from the Lord through his servants, not directly from the one you're ministering to, as though you are owed for the gospel, as though you are the source of the gospel.
Right. Now, so I feel like we have a pretty good understanding of the general view of the principle. Let's talk about the history of this topic a little bit. And I think that's probably, outside of the application of the principle, the history is probably what I've seen people have the most questions about. That's what I originally had questions about. It's like, well, this is the first book really written on this topic, then how is ministry sports historically done in the church? And you talk about this in chapter 10, and you talk about the type of ministry fundraising from quite a few documents of the early church. Can you talk about a little bit about the sources that you use and what you found from those sources?
Sure. So yeah, just in brief, from the Subapostolic church, Subapostolic meaning the time immediately after the apostles, we had the Didache, the shepherd of Hermas, and then Apollonius, who does not have his own extant writings, but is recorded in Erasmus's history. So each one of these spoke poorly of anyone who would require payment in exchange for teaching or for prophesying. They would consider this definitionally to be a false teacher. In the Didache, you have it said that if someone comes to your town and asks for money in exchange for their teaching, it doesn't say it exactly that way, but if a teacher comes to your town and asks for money, you consider him a false teacher and send him on his way. And that's pretty much the same message you get in the Shepherd of Hermas and in Apollonius, in slightly different ways. But the argument that I'm making there in chapter 10 is some doctrinal things you might expect a little clarity that rises then after the beginnings of the church, like for example the Trinity, right? Not a lot of clarity actually at the beginning, but then it rises. Practices work the opposite way, where practices they should be doing these things immediately, and then you start to see them decline. And so what I argue is this is a practice. It is something where you see a lot of clarity very early on, and it's kind of lost and has to be recaptured later. And it's only recaptured as much as it is needed. So at the time of the Reformation, it was recaptured significantly. In fact, that's what the whole Reformation was around, was the sale of indulgences. And so there was a very significant recapturing of this principle, but not with the kind of articulation that I'm trying to provide. And I believe that beginning in the mid-1700s, all the way to now, and especially now in the past 50 years, with the advent of digital media, you've seen a greater need to recapture this principle and with better distinctions and better nuance. Okay, you're muted, I think.
On mute.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of got into it right at the end there of what you're talking about. But the book's subtitle, of course, is called A Biblical Response to the Commercialization of Christianity. You gave some time frames there. I want to talk about the when
Yeah.
But also, because we talked about this in our first conversation, what was the marker of what you would call the commercialization?
Right. Well, yeah. So with that subtitle, it's not a, I'm not defining some kind of historical movement. Uh, I'm just saying any kind of commercialization, the commercialization of Christianity happened uh, in uh, Second Corinthians when the super apostles,
Right,
were taking money
right,
from the Corinthians. It happened. It's always happened, and it will continue to happen. Um, However, when did it become a more significant issue? Yeah, over time, where you have things like the sales of indulgence, right? Things like the as a Baptist, and given some of the things I say in the parachurch ministry chapter, I do think there is a significance to the rise of the episcopate, and and that leading to church building efforts and things like that that strayed away from co-labor models. Although I'm not sure I'd be able to define that well, but it's very clear how that comes out in indulgences.
sure.
Now, later on, what happens is so you have the printing press, and initially people want to write books, right? And the printer wants to sell books. So you go give your manuscript to the printer, and they print the book if they think they can make money off of it. So you have this clear distinction between the one who's doing gospel ministry and this other entity who's doing this secular work, making money. And to make a modern analogy, something that I considered doing, the publisher has asked me not to, because they want to make this really clear. They're probably even more passionate about this topic than I am. But if I were to sell the physical book on Amazon, even for free, Amazon would be charging $4 shipping, right? And so there you'd have me as a minister sincerely giving, and Amazon no concern for sincerity, because they're not in it for ministry, and not a problem. They would be charging for the shipping. And so that's kind of how it originally worked. And I have a quote from a book that I think would be useful. This is from S.H. Steinberg's 500 Years of Printing. Until the middle of the 18th century, it was considered bad manners to write for remuneration instead of for reputation. Up to that time only, a few writers had ever received a fee for their publishers, and if they received it, they were anxious to hide the fact. Erasmus, for instance, this is the Erasmus that interacted with Martin Luther, was deeply hurt when some Italian colleagues hinted that Aldus Manutius had paid him for a book, and he violently defended himself against similar insinuations, and so on. And then it goes on to say Luther never received so much as a farthing for hundreds of books and pamphlets. And so then later on, in 1710, you have the first modern copyright law, which is the Statute of Anne. And then with the Statute of Anne, now authors are able to sell the rights to their book, right? They're not just saying, hey, I want you to print this. Hopefully you can make some kind of profit off it, just print it. Now they're saying, okay, if you give me money, you can print this. And so after 1710, you have this market developing for books like this. And I don't know if Christians began engaging in that at the same rate that the world did. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, but just kind of along with the world's model of copyright and printing and publishing, the church falls into this pattern. And then, as I said, in the past 50 years, you have the advent of digital media. Now, content is so divorced from the paper and binding that you can sell just the digital content on its own, and people do sell it for money, right? And it becomes very obvious now that it's not, hey, you're not just selling the paper, right? You're selling the teaching itself.
Right. Because like you said, you're separating it from the material that's printed on.
Right. Yeah. So historically, the argument I'm making here is that I believe I can account for why this hasn't been talked about with such degree of clarity in the church before, and why it needs to be now. And 100 or 300 years for a problem to develop, that's no unusual thing in church history.
Right. That's really interesting, that quote you brought up. So what that quote is essentially saying is that writers of books sound like they were actually embarrassed to be accused of accepting money from the printers, right?
Right. Yeah. If you were doing this for money, that undermines your sincerity, just like the definition of the Dorean Principle says.
That's really interesting. Okay, so I think the most common question that I got, this is what my co-blogger Austin was really wondering, is we look at men through history, whether it be early church fathers like Augustine, the scholastics with Aquinas, Anselm, and the guys in between them, the reformers, and the Puritans. And historically, how do you have any insight on how those men had their ministry support and how they were able to write so much content and be supported?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, especially as we go further back in history. Yeah, my knowledge mostly comes from knowing about modern copyright law and what that did to publishing. But I imagine it was largely funded by the churches and uh, ecclesiastical units that were interested in having these things developed. Also, there were often patrons for these things. I forgot to mention that. A lot of times people would publish a book with a dedication, hoping that the entity that they're dedicating it to will, in turn, fund fund that work. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so that was another common practice.
Okay. Yeah, and I was thinking about it last night.
And that obviously is more modern than way back with the early patristics, but yeah.
Right, right. I was thinking about that question last night actually, and I realized, well, almost pretty much all those men I listed were pastors or maybe bishops if they refer themselves that. So they were most likely already being supported by their congregation.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, if I were to, one of the things I'd like to do to follow up on this book, I don't know where it falls in my list of priorities, but I would love to make just a minimal 1 hour long, low budget documentary just about the history of the commercialization of Christianity. I think that would get people very interested in this topic if they could just watch a timeline of, oh, the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, and then you have, the advent of modern printing and indulgences and just all these things. I think that would make a very interesting documentary. If anybody listening to this
yeah.
has some experience in putting those
Right.
kinds of things together.
If anybody wants to co-labor alongside that project,
Yeah,
reach out to
absolutely.
Conley. Okay, so we talked about the principle, we've talked about the history now. There's it's actually, I think it was, I'm not sure if you remember this, but in our first conversation, when I called you, you made a passing joke saying, well, I kind of wrote this book just so I could rant about copyright and intellectual property in the appendix. Um, but the idea of copyright and intellectual property as legitimate categories of natural rights, I think is a really important uh, topic that intersects with the Dorean Principle and the application of it. Can you explain, because there's different categories within intellectual property, so a patent isn't the same as a
Yeah,
copyright. Copyrights aren't the same as trademarks. Explain what copyright is.
sure, sure. So, yeah, just for a little bit of background. So, Chapter 13 essentially argues that ministers should not be litigating copyright, and they should ideally use a few modern methods that I mentioned in the book to make it clear to people that they won't litigate copyright. So what copyright is, uh, and I probably have a better definition of it in the book. I think in the either in chapter 13 or in Appendix B.
Hmm.
But it's any kind of uh, government enforced restriction on the use or distribution or modification of a work, of a creative work.
And you talk about in the book how copyright, it's not um, an opt-in institution. A copyright is, you have to actually opt out of the copyright. You talk about that with pastors who write books specifically.
Right. Yeah. Some people talk about, I copyrighted my work. And what they really mean is they were like registered with the Copyright Office. It was already copyrighted by US law. I don't actually know how it works in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, as soon as it is in a fixed medium, as soon as it's out of your mind and on the paper, it's copyrighted.
Hmm. Right.
Um, yeah. And just a little bit more, because I think this is where the conversation is going. So chapter 13 is saying that, right, ministers should not litigate. I have an Appendix C, which goes further beyond anything the Dorean Principle has to do with it. And I argue that biblically, I don't think intellectual property is a real category or or one that we should um, one that we should be making laws around.
We shouldn't protect it as we do other
Right.
properties. Right.
Right. Yeah. It's not in the same category as physical property, which is real property. There is a meaning to the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. There is such a thing as private property. If you've read the Second London Baptist Confession, it even talks about this. Yeah, but I don't believe the same things apply to intellectual property.
Right.
Now, you had asked me about the different kinds. There is patent law, which has to do with inventions, and then also trademark. Interestingly, patent law and copyright, those have to do with whether real or just perceived violations of the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal, right? Trademark really has more to do with the ninth commandment, right? Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. So I think there's a lot of legitimacy to trademark. So yeah, when I'm saying IP, the three branches IP, I'm really talking about the first two that I think are more problematic.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that clarifier. And so we kind of already talked about open source. To bring that up again, open source is a type of development software where you basically open up to the public to allow them to do what they want with the product that they bought, right? And so we talked about this right before the meeting, but when I first opened up the book, something that made me laugh was in the endorsements pages, there's two men who are pretty much just listed as open source devs. So somebody who's not familiar with that, that's essentially a software developer. I'm like, what the heck do software developers have to do with essentially a theology book? But what do you think the church can learn from what's going on with open source with software? Because I do think that software development and open source development is kind of one of the leaders in this area, just in general. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Yeah. So software engineers have been taking creative approaches to copyright and licensing for some time in order to, like I was saying earlier, make a better environment for engineers to do engineering. Now, yeah, generally, I'm always suspicious of anything where someone is suggesting that the church follows something that's going on in the world. But
Right.
Here is one case where you have a lot of people thinking deeply about the utility of copyright, and the church has not done a lot of deep thinking about the utility of copyright, and that's to be expected. So I do think that that leaders ought to think about what some of these minds have considered as far as the legal ramifications of these things. And interestingly, as many Christians, especially in 2020, but for the past few years now, have been more interested in government and the limits of government, I think there's more cause for this is becoming within the area that the church is currently thinking about is, well, what things should the government be able to enforce? And I would argue that if someone's going to be consistent going along those lines, if you're upset about mask mandates, things like that, you should start thinking about copyright too.
Right.
Because it fits right in there. What right does the government have to oppose my use of knowledge that is in my head, whether I got it from somewhere else or not?
Right, exactly. Now, one of the interesting topics that you get into with copyright is you talk about how it's not always people in the church who are kind of problems enforcing copyright law. You talk about how it's a lot of secular institutions who actually have the original manuscripts and the critical editions of those manuscripts enforcing copyright law, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so specifically talking about the Bible, manuscripts of the Bible. So manuscripts of the Bible are very old. Technically, they're public domain. However, when they are photographed and digitized, and that is still public domain according to all court precedent that I am aware of about it. A lot of museums that own these things still assert copyright over the photographs so that they can control its use and so that they can make sure that there's an income stream. And they don't have a lot of a lot to lose by asserting that. I have a friend who displayed pictures of these manuscripts up on his website, and he got a takedown email from a museum telling them that he couldn't do this. And what's he going to do? Like, go up against this museum? And they're expensive lawyers? No way. So he just took it down.
Right.
But yeah, so you have these secular institutions enforcing copyright, and then Christian institutions, like, for example, the Center for the Studies of New Testament Manuscripts. I think I said that right. It's a long, it's a long name.
Yeah.
But they, whether or not they agree with these copyrights, they respect them so that they can continue working with these organizations that own the manuscripts and keep them happy. And in the end, if you, as a layman Christian who don't know, the magical open sesame to say at whatever door, you can't get access to some of the manuscripts of the Bible. Now, I don't want to suggest that any layman should be too concerned about the integrity of the text that you hold in your hand. I do believe it's been well handled, but there's a lack of transparency that I think a lot of Christians have taken for granted exists when it doesn't.
Yeah. Right. Now, to kind of conclude our conversation, what has been the general response? You had a pretty diverse array of endorsements in your book, but have you received a lot of criticism, a lot of support? What has that been like?
Yeah. Just one thing I want to mention before I forget. Something that comes out when I talk about copyright and things is people's concerns about plagiarism. Because copyright has been used to prevent plagiarism, a lot of people think that was the purpose of copyright. Copyright was designed to prevent copying and modification, reproduction. It was not designed to prevent people from taking credit for someone else's work. So I do think that plagiarism is a real issue. I just don't believe that copyright is the law to handle it.
Right.
I believe there are defamation laws and similar things that would do a better job if people made use of those instead.
Right. The ninth can be broken, whether there's copyright law or not.
Right. The ninth commandment. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So, and if you think about it, it's still a problem if I, as a modern day pastor, plagiarize Spurgeon in my sermon, but all his stuff is out of copyright. I'm still doing something wrong. It's not a.
And we could go through the process to realize and give evidence that you did bear false witness, even though they are public domain. Right.
Yeah. So you asked about reception. So I have been surprised at how positive the reception has been. I'm threatening a very sacred cow here, right? This is the way that much of more notable ministry is done, right? Most ministry is just done in the local church through the support of the local church, but the most notable ministry happens through books and happens through this very this traditional model that's been around for the past 300 years of using copyright to get royalties on sales of books. And so I anticipated a lot of negative feedback. It's been surprisingly minimal. It's very few that have pushed back against it. I think those who'd feel more threatened by it it's not on their radar yet, even though I've tried reaching out to them.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this becomes more popular, if people start thinking about it, if there will be more serious blowback. But I've been surprised. A lot of people have questions and concerns. There are a few people who have pushed back who just don't understand it really.
Sure.
They think I'm saying we're not obligated to ministers in any sense, or they think I'm saying we shouldn't support our pastors, or that the worker's not worthy of his wages, which I'm not saying any of those
You're
things.
not saying that at all.
Yeah. I mean, I would, if I were king, every pastor would be paid, more than they are now. But yeah, that's not the issue. It's the mechanism by which they are paid.
Right. And our confession of faith as Reformed Baptists actually very clearly teaches on that pastors should be paid.
It does, right? Yeah, and I fully affirm 26:10 that says that.
Right.
And I think one of the benefits of this book too, originally I wrote it to call to repentance those who have strayed from this principle, but as I've presented it to some people, I've met a number of people who are either bivocational pastors by conviction. I'm a bivocational pastor, but not by conviction, right? Just by circumstance.
Yeah.
Or people who think that there's something wrong with their pastor being paid. And hopefully this alleviates some consciences who were already pricked by these verses but didn't know how to take them. So I'm hoping that it frees up some consciences as well as binds others.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And you kind of brought up the most common instance of ministry that's being talked about with this is books. But I think one of the more impactful one would probably be seminary, um, which is interesting because that's probably, you would think that that's where most of the legitimate criticism will come from. Now, so you've now, obviously you live up to what you teach in the book. The book is for free, whether it's hard copy or the software version. Do you have any tips or wisdom for ministers who are thinking, I agree with this, but I just don't see it being feasible to really be able to get a book out to people for free, relying solely on co-labor, just from the process that you went through?
Right. It doesn't cost that much these days to do this. Now, I did do a lot of things myself. I did my own typesetting. I had someone else design the cover. The publisher is funding the shipping. I funded the printing. My church funded the printing. So, just to do a small run of books does not cost that much. We're talking about a few $1,000s. You can either work with your church, or people have had a lot of success with Kickstarter and Patreon and things like that. So what I think is not feasible is bearing the risk of putting something out there, doing all that work ahead of time, not knowing whether or not anyone's going to buy it. It's so much better to fundraise upfront and know you have the money and others are shouldering the risk with you. Because most ministers who publish something, it's not going to get much reception, and I think that they're doing themselves a disservice by shouldering all this risk with visions of grandeur, when
Right.
in reality, it may or may not pan out.
That's actually a really good point that I haven't thought about. Publishers take a risk by saying, we'll fund this book in hopes that we'll be able to profit off of it after the fact through reciprocity. And you actually, I can't remember if this was in the book. I couldn't find it in the book over the past couple of days. I think you might have talked about it either with AD or with me privately, but you talked about how, let's say you have a guy who comes up to you, Conley, I don't know if I can do this because if I did fund maybe a book or a class or some type of ministry through co-labor instead of reciprocity, I wouldn't get any support and I wouldn't be able to fund it. And you say, well, that might actually be a tool of discernment to say maybe there's not a need for that ministry.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that. And maybe a providential sign, that this isn't the right time for that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if churches want to band together and support something, that's a good sign that the Lord's at work. So,
Right.
So yeah, it is kind of similar to the way a lot of people think about their calling as a pastor. They're like, oh, I feel internally called. It's like, well, wait, are you externally called as well? Have there been a bunch of people that agree with you, on this matter?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is one way of seeing that ministry through, making sure that it's a work that is needed and that you have the confirmation of others on.
Right. And yeah, that just brings me back to seminaries. I think a co-labor support for seminary education would really force the co-laborers to assess not only the internal calling of the man, but also it would really force an external call, which, like you said, is necessary.
Right. Yeah. Right now, and we've mentioned seminaries without exactly explaining, but right now most seminaries operate on this reciprocity model where, I give you money, you give me religious education, you teach me the Bible.
Right.
And Yeah, so right now, because there's this whole institution and enterprise around, educating men in seminary, uh, yeah, some of the teachers go off base. People aren't quite sure what the leadership is doing, but hey, this degree is still very meaningful. So I'm going to still, send my, uh, you know, this young man I've got in the church to that institution because, that degree has a lot of value. Um, and I don't really have a way of holding them accountable either in any means other than, sending this person or not sending him. But if you don't have that, concern about one individual and it's more, is this a good ministry or is this not? And you're able to clearly, have this clear-headed approach to, how much should we be funding them? Then I think, yeah, there's just more opportunities to draw support away and to put pressure on institutions to correct as they're liberalizing, which seminaries inevitably do.
Right, right. Now, before we wrap up the conversation, is there anything else that you would like to add or comments you'd like to make?
I well, definitely. Uh, yeah, the book's available at thedoreanprinciple.org. Dorian is spelled Dorean.
Yep.
I'm trying to grow the Facebook group about it, which is called Money and Ministry. I really want that to be the central hub where a lot of people are talking about it. I know that not everybody's on Facebook, and that's fine. But yeah, just trying to, that really helps me gauge what the interest is and where we should go next with this. So yeah, please join the group if you can.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
guess that's the main thing.
Yep. Yeah, I was gonna plug the group. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book. I hope that uh, this benefit all the listeners and brought greater clarity and hopefully this interview promotes some discussion about the topic, whether it's critical or positive. I think that would really help the laymen who are trying to assess the legitimacy of the Dorean principle. So thank you, Conley.
Right. Yeah. If anyone out there knows of any more well-known person that wants to talk to me and examine this, that'd be great. Because a lot of people like you are waiting for, the yeah, the bigger shoes to weigh in on this.
Right, right, definitely. Yeah. So thank you, Conley.
Yeah, you're welcome.